Yeah, good to go. We are up to Daf Kufches. We're about 10 lines from the top. And we are up to Omer Rav Yehuda. Zog Tehelige Rav Yehuda. We're 10 lines from the top and Daf Kufches Omer Aleph. Omer Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, Hakoil le'igle gapa. If a city needs to seal its doors and to fix the doors and the lock for security purposes, everybody has to chip in for security of the city. Even if there is an estate that's being preserved for the benefit of Yisoimim, that estate has to contribute as well. Aval Rabbanon, but the Rabbanon, the Talmid Chacham of the city, loy, they don't have to share and contribute to a security levy. Why? My timer. Rabbanon loy tzrichin eterusa. Rabbanon don't need a shmirah. And Rashi says, you know why they don't need a shmirah? As we say in the nusach of the Siyum of a Masechta, the Torah of the Talmid Chacham protects him. Hishmar Allah. We don't need security if we have the Torah. Zok to Gemara, Havel Lekare Pasya. What if it's to dig a well to provide drinking water for the community? They're vafilu merabah. Of course, the Rabbanon have to participate in that as well, because they do need to drink. So they have to participate in the digging of a well. When do the Rabbanon have to participate? That's if the participation means contributing funds. But what if it was demanded of each citizen to come with a shovel and help dig? That we don't force the Rabbanon to do. Rabbanon la b'nei mepak bechluzanin. They don't go with shovels and dig. It's not appropriate for the Rabbanon to do that. Omer Rav Yehuda, Lakara de Nahara. In the olden days, there would be a river that would go, of course, flow downhill. And all of the communities along that river would divert some of the water to irrigate their fields. Well, what if there was a blockage in the river and needed to be dredged out? So, depending on where the blockage is, would determine who has to help. If the blockage was all the way at the top, so nobody was getting water, then everybody downstream of that blockage would have a responsibility to contribute to dredging their river. The people at the bottom have to help the people at the top dredge out the river, because they also need that to be clear in order for the water to get to them. But what if the river was clear but the bottom by the last guy, it's blocked? There, the last guy's got to clear it himself, because nobody above benefits if that's cleared. To the contrary, they benefit if it's not cleared. It acts like a little dam backing the water up, giving them more water. However, what if the purpose of this was not to irrigate, but it was a ditch to allow our drain water to drain away from the city? Then it's exactly the opposite. It's the opposite. If we're talking about a trench that's draining away wastewater, there everybody needs the guy at the bottom. If the guy at the bottom is blocked, it backs up to everybody. So everybody's got to chip in for the blockage at the bottom, but the people at the bottom do not have to chip in for the blockage at the top. Tani Namiyachi, we have a brayta that supports this halacha. If there's 5 gardens, one downstream of the other, that are all getting its water from one source, from one well that was flowing downstream, and the whole mine is no longer producing water, everybody has to help fix it because they all need it. Email Yoina together with the guy on top. But that means the guy at the bottom, no matter where the well goes bad, he has to help everybody. But if the well only goes bad down by the lowest guy, their chedek they have to do on their own, no one's going to help them. But on the other hand, if it was a drainage canal, then kulam misaknis him. Everybody has to help the guy at the bottom because they all need it to be clear all the way to the bottom. The guy at the top will have to help everybody because he needs everybody downstream to be clear. But if only his area is blocked, then he's on his own. Nobody below must help. Amar Shmuel. Now, in the time of the Persians, they had a crazy rule. They didn't care who was the registered owner of a property. If you wanted to pay the land tax for this property this year, you could use it. So what if a guy goes right up against the riverbank and grabs a piece of property right there? And then happens to be that area is normally a public dock where people load and unload their boats. So by you now building stuff or planting stuff there, you're going to impede the rabbim to load or unload. But the fact is, you have a legal right to seize that land because that's how the Persian Empire worked. So chatziva hava, you're called a mechutzev because how dare you block and impede people's access to unload their boats? But we're not going to force him to leave and give up the property because legally he's allowed to use it and he's impeding them. He's not blocking them completely. But the ha'idna de kakosvi parsoi knilach admolei tzaver susyomayo, and I'll touch it like Rashi. Nowadays, where the Persians write that the person who takes the property right up along the water, not only does he get to have the property abutting the water, but he also gets to have part inside the water up until it's about 8 feet deep, the neck of the susim. So there, normally what happens is, even though a person sees that property, a menschlich, a guy, will put up a gate, not in the water to impede anybody, not right at the edge of the water, but he'll make it, let's say, 50 feet back. And even though all that property between his fence into the water is his, or it's under his control, but he's not going to take it over because he doesn't want to get in people's way. So let's say a guy came along and seized the property from the fence into the water. There you could throw him away. You know why? Because that property really belongs to the guy who put up his fence, who seems to be only starting from 30 feet from the river. He really owns through the river, and therefore you can throw him out. That is how Rashi learns Pshat. Tosfos learns Pshat to the contrary. You're the only one seizing there. There's no one there before you. But since you're going to own into the water, then your mamish going to impede the marine traffic because boats can't even go by. You're going to be blocking them. That's already too much. Their abundant will force him to leave. Let's say two brothers had two properties. Let's say one was, we'll call it one property A, and one would be property C, and he took property B, or Ubeni Shutfe. Two shutfes, one at property A, one at property C, and he took property B, the one in the middle. That's a very chutzpah thing to do. It's wrong. So Luki loy misalkin, but we're not going to force him to give it up. Rab Nachman Amar nami misalkina. No, in this case, we will force him to give up the property so that the two brothers could share in it, or the two shutfim could share in it. What about Dina the Bar Mitzvah? The Image of Dina Bar Mitzvah, aren't they? If they're abutting it, why isn't there issue of Dina Bar Mitzvah? Loy misalkinin loy. You don't push them away. Why not? Because we're not speaking about a purchase here. We're speaking about the same thing in the Persian Empire where you just seized it for the year. That's not a permanent purchase. That's not where the luck of Dina the Bar Mitzvah applies.
Isn't that like a right of way?
No, it's like three properties, one beside the other, and you're going to seize the central property.
It would be like a right of way. I mean, everybody has a right to go to the.
No, nobody has a right. It's a private property, but the rule is if you park there and you pay the taxes, then you have that property for the year. But nobody can walk through it.
Okay.
So Zog to Gemara, the Edina the bar mitzvah. What about forget if their brother is part just Edina bar mitzvah? The two neighbors should have the right to take that property first. Loim is alkinulay because again, this is not a purchase. This is just a yearly grabbing based on the Persian law. But Nardai Amri afilu mishum Dina the bar mitzvah is alkinulay. Even for this, we apply the rule of Dina the bar mitzvah. Mishum shenemar because it says in the pasuk, "Vayisisa yasher v'atoy b'nei Hashem," and that applies even when you're just seizing it. Zok to Gemara. What happens? Actually, I know somebody personally. Actually, we all know somebody personally. It's just that I know this story, and most people don't know what's going on. Who in Lakewood, he did exactly this. He wanted to buy a property, but before he bought the property, he asked the neighbors, "Do you mind if I buy it?" Also, Imlich Bey. He went to the neighbor and he said, "I want to buy this property. Do you want it? I don't want to buy it if you're going to want it." Omer Lay, Ezel Lisbon, I'd like to buy this property. He said, "Okay." And the neighbor said, "No problem. I have no akpad to go buy it." So the Shiloh was, is it enough that he gave you a verbal commitment? Or do you have to make a kinyan? Otherwise, he can come back later and say he wants it. Ravina Amar, Lloyd Tzarech Lemiklimine. You don't make a kinyan. If you agreed verbally, that's good enough. Nardoi Amri, Shricha Lemiklimine. A verbal commitment is not enough. You have to make a legal transaction. For Hilchazo, we paskin halacha lemaisa tzarech lemiklimine. So this is exactly what happened to a friend of mine. And he didn't make a kinyan. And now 2 years later, of course, in Lakewood, the property is worth double what it was worth 5 years ago. And now the guy's saying, "Din the bar mitzvah, I want this property for the price that you originally had paid for it." What a chutzpah. Now, on Amud Beis, we're going to see that the whole concept of Din bar mitzvah does not apply at all to a property where you're going to live in, where you're going to put a house on. It's only relevant to fields where you're planting, because why should you have to move your tractor from one field to another location if you could just have one big field and it'll be so much easier for you to work the field? That's what Din bar mitzvah is based on. So the whole concept of Din bar mitzvah doesn't even apply to houses. But this guy is dealing with a big issue there, because some of the Botadinim you might say are compromised. Zog to Gemara weiter. So the halacha is so Zog to Gemara Hashu the Amrit tzarech lemiklimine. So now that you're saying that unless there's a kinyan done, the neighbor can come and demand the property. Eloi kondomine. Let's say he didn't do the kinyan, which is what I'm talking about over here. And a yiker v'zul, it either went up or down. Bershu say we consider the increase in price or the decrease in price for the neighbor because he gets it, and we sort of look at it like the person who bought it, the innocent l'kayach who bought it with permission, is buying it b'shlichus for the neighbor, but the neighbor gets it. So therefore, Zobin b'ma. What if the stranger bought it for $100,000, and 2 years later, now b'shavi masan, it's worth $200,000? We see if in fact that's what it was worth when he bought it. Chazina, ilakula alma kamazila umasbin. If anybody who would have bought it, the seller would have sold it to him for 100, and he's not doing a favor like giving a gift, it's a regular sale. Therefore, yoiv le'meya, the neighbor could just give the buyer 100,000, which is what he paid for it. V'shakal, and he can take the field away, even though now it might be worth a lot more. V'iloi, and if not, then if it's really valued at 200, then yoiv le'masan v'shakal, he'll have to give him 200. What happened if it's Zobin b'masan? He bought it for 200, v'shav meya, so he overpaid for it, and now the guy wants the field from him. So the halacha is sabar mina motzi amar lei l'sekuna shadad dechaloi lavasi. I don't got to pay 200. I don't have to pay 200, and therefore you're not a shliach. Everything is bottle, and I can now just buy it off the owner for 100. Amalei Markishisha b'reider of Chizta l'Ravashi. Markishisha, the son of Rav Chizta, told Ravashi, "Hachi amin ardoi b'shum Rav Nachman, ein enola kakos." There's no eno, and therefore the mecher is not bought, and therefore the bar metra can either pay him what he paid for it, or he doesn't get it. So I just want to stop a second and talk about Mar Keshisha. Rab Chisda had two sons named Mar. There was the Mar Keshisha and there was the Mar Yenukta. So the Pashup shot you would say is Mar Keshisha means the older brother, Mar Yenukta is the younger brother. But there's a shot that it's exactly the opposite. Mar Keshisha means he was born when his father was old, and Mar Yenukta means he was born when his father was young, which would make the Mar Yenukta older and the Mar Keshisha young. Zok Gemara. What if a guy wanted to make a shtickle scam? I didn't want to sell it to the bar metra. I wanted to help somebody else. But there's a problem with bar metra. So you know what he did? He first sold a piece of property within his property. So let's say my property is 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet. I sold this buyer a square 100 feet by 100 feet in the center of my property. So he's landlocked by my property. Now he is a bar metra himself. Now this guy who bought this piece inside is a neighbor to all my properties. So what happens if Zobin Legur Yuya the Ara, the Metzia Nichsi, smack in the middle of his property? Hasinan we see, if this patch that he sold him is quite different from the property all around, so there's a legitimate reason why he severed this area and sold it individually, that's a legitimate sale. And therefore, Zivine, it's a legitimate sale. Now he's a legitimate neighbor, and if he wants to sell the rest of his property, he can sell it to this guy who is now a neighbor. However, let's turn on to Amud Beis. V'loi, but what if there's no reason at all why the piece of property that he bought smack in the middle would have been different and would have been sold for no other reason? Clearly, arume kama'arim. They're just trying to get around and have a loophole to get out of bar metra. That's not going to be legitimate. How about matana? I want to give a field, and I don't want to give it to my two neighbors. I want to give it to somebody I want to give it to. They're less b'mishum din bar metra. Of course, that wouldn't be governed by the halacha of bar metra. Amar Meimar, because of le'achrayis, I gifted a field, but I wrote in the star of the matana that should this field get taken away from you, I'll pay you back. Now that's insane on the matana. Nobody does that on the matana. They only do it on the sale. So the fact that you wrote a chrayis on the star matana shows us that you probably took cash from him on the side, didn't tell anybody there was a sale, but just used the matana to get around bar metra. But really, it's a sale because otherwise, why did you write a chrayis? And therefore, ispa mishum din bar metra. What happens if machar kol nechasav lech? Somebody wanted to liquidate all of his nechasim wherever they were, and he sold it to one person. Less ba mishum din bar metra. No din bar metra, because no individual neighbor can tell me this property you should have pulled out of the deal and sold to me. No, you wouldn't want to have bought all my properties. So I want to sell everything together to make it easier for me, and you can't stop me. And we're soon going to see, Rashi is going to tell us beferish, that the din of the bar metra is not any chiyuv on the moich. It's a chiyuv on the lekeach. Because vasizav vayasher means if it's not impacting you, if it's not hurting you, do the right thing. Why did you have to buy this property? There's other properties you could have bought. This guy would benefit much more from this property because he's a neighbor. You find yourself a different property. But from the moicher's perspective, you can't tell him that because the moicher can tell you, I didn't have to sell anything. I don't owe you anything because I had a right not to sell it and keep it completely. So the whole vayisisha v'yasher b'toy is only a halacha to the lekeach, not to the moicher. Okay, so to the more weiter. And therefore, however, even though the halacha of din bar metra is not a chiv on the moicher, the only time we enforce it on the lekeach is if it's not impacting the moicher negative. But if by enforcing din bar metra, it hurts the moicher because he wanted to sell all of his nechosim together, you're supposed to be yosher b'toiv to the neighbor. Maybe be yosher b'toiv to the moicher because his sale will work out better if he can sell it all together. Okay, how about the bailam harishon? You sold the property to someone who wasn't a neighbor, but he had originally owned this property. Maybe you bought it from him years ago. Then less bar mishum din bar metra. Once again, there's no din of bar metra. How about Zoban? Hey, Akum. What if the owner was a goy? You bought it from a goy. Or Zoban le'akum. You sold it to a goy who doesn't have a halacha of din bar metra. He's a goy. Therefore, less bar mishum din bar metra. Zoban me'akum. I could say, I'm doing you a favor. The Omer Le Ari Avrchele Mimitra. You had a goy next door to you. He could steal from you. He can vandalize you. I got him away. I did you all a favor by buying it. You can't have time something you wanted to buy. You should have bought it. I came and saved you. Now you have a Jewish neighbor, an honest neighbor. You don't have to deal with a lie next. Zamin Liakum. And if you sold it to a goy, there's no din of metra. Because Akum Vadai La Bar Vasizah Yoshev Toiv. A goy is not a bar, she's a goy, and you can only enforce it on the lekech, as Rashi says, you cannot enforce it on the mother. However, if you sell to a goy, that means you're bringing trash into the neighborhood. That means you're impacting the neighbors, because now they have to live there, some undesirable who could steal from them, who could bother them, and therefore, shamuti vade mishamtinole. This seller, you will put him into chayr, ad mekabel alei kol insei the osile machmose. Until he says, if you suffer any damage from your new neighbor, I will pay for it. I will indemnify you. If he doesn't say that, and he's not makabel that, he is in chayr. How about mashkanta? Reuben owed Shimon $100,000, so he gave Shimon a field as a mashkanta. So Shimon was operating the field now and getting the payers. Now Shimon wants to buy it off Reuben, but the neighbors say, no, we're first. Less about mishum din bar metra. Why? The Amar Vashi, Amar Li Sabi de Masa Machasya. The elders of Masa Machasya told me, my mashkanta, where does the word mashkanta come from? As a surety. It means the shchuna gabei. You live there. So if that's what it means, that you live there, now you are a neighbor as well. My nafkamina, l'may nafkamina, that mashkanta means the shchuna gabei, the din bar metra, that you have the first right to buy the property. What about if the moicher, his property was too far for him, it was inconvenient, and he wanted to buy a property closer to home for him, and he found one, and now he's in a rush to quickly sell his field so he has the money to buy the other field that he wants, and he has no option to delay because otherwise the property that he wants to buy might get sold. So limcher berachik v'ligal b'karev or berah v'ligal b'yafa less b'mishudin by metra. Once again, because you're not going to negatively impact the moicher by forcing the lekeach to first negotiate with the neighbor and see. The moicher wants the deal to be done very quickly because he needs the cash quickly to be able to buy the property that he's looking for, and he shouldn't lose the opportunity. How about the cargo, which is the head tax? The king has a head tax. If you don't pay the tax, he takes your head. So it's very urgent. Rashi says that means if a person owes money to support his wife or to support his wife's daughters, where there's a tnai k'tuba that he has to pay for them, you're allowed to sell and not worry about the metra, because again, you need to do it quickly. We'll look for it. What if someone died? And we need money, family needs money to bury him. They're allowed to sell the field to anybody, first buyer that comes along, because they need the money right away. How do you know that these things are so urgent? Head tax, supporting children, and burying a mace. Because you see another leniency to show that it's very important to get these things done quickly. Normally, when you sell someone's nechasim and he's not there, you need to advertise them heavily to make sure that we extract the maximum value out of the properties. But when you need money in a very big hurry, like in these three cases, we allow Bezin to sell for a price that they feel is reasonable without going through the entire sales process. So you see that urgency to make this transaction very quick. How about a woman who violated and bought a property and now the two neighbors want to take it away from her? Or Liyasmi, Yisayim did that. Or Shutfi, we'll see what those are. Less ba mishum din bar metra. There's no din bar metra. A woman's akrashi because it's not the norm for a woman to be going out looking for properties. So therefore, This property was offered to her. She bought it. She didn't have to look around. You can't tell her go somewhere else. Yas made the same thing. Shutfa means as follows. What would be if there was a property that belonged to Shutfim? So there's A, B, and C. B, the center property, belonged to Shutfim. Reuben and Shimon were Shutfim. And one Shutf, Reuben sold his share to the other Shutf. A or B can't say, hey, you can't sell your share to the other Shutf. We're neighbors, sell it to us. Or even if you consider yourself neighbors, we should get part of it. You shouldn't be able to buy the whole thing. You should split it with us. Because we're going to see at the bottom of the Gemara, if multiple neighbors all want it, they split it. So by Shutvim, you don't have the Allah of Din Metzia, I'm allowed to sell it to my Shutv. He comes before your other neighbors. Less ba, you should Din Metzia. Now, if you noticed, up until now, the Psak Halacha that the Gemara said was either Yesh Mishum Din Metzia or less Mishum Din Metzia. The next set of cases, the Gemara uses a different lotion. Shchena Yair b'Shchena Sada, Shchena Yair Kodim. So Rashi does both tell us we're no longer talking about the actual Allah of Din Metzia. The Gemara is just giving you advice when you have such a scenario and you need to make a decision. What is the best decision to make? But not that anything here is binding. So what happens if I have a neighbor? I have a next door neighbor. His name is Yankee Samsonovich. And I happen to have a property out of Mississauga, and he wants to buy my property in Mississauga. Now, my office is on Bentworth. I have a neighbor on Bentworth. Metzia Zlotnik is my neighbor on Bentworth. And Metzia Zlotnik says, I want to buy your property in Mississauga. So I have a neighbor in my business who wants to buy my property in Mississauga, and I have a neighbor in my house who wants to buy my property in Mississauga. Who should I sell to? This is not Dinei Bar Metzia. Neither of them are Bar Metzia. The property in Mississauga is not connected to anything. So the halacha is, you know what you should do? I should sell to Samsonovich. Because it's more important to be good with the neighbor where you live with, rather than the neighbor in the office. I guess this way, if my wife needs to borrow some eggs, they won't be upset. She'll be able to borrow eggs. How about a shachin v'talmud chacham? What if my next neighbor, Samsonovich, wants to buy my property in Mississauga, and a Talmud Chacham wants to borrow my property in Mississauga? The problem is Samsonovich is my shachin and he's a Talmud Chacham. So Luya Yitzur, I would have a neighbor who's not a Talmud Chacham, and he wanted to buy my property in Mississauga. And Samsonovich, a Talmud Chacham, wanted to buy my property in Mississauga. Talmud Chacham kodim. Korov the Talmud. What if you have a relative who wants to buy the property? Or a Talmud Chacham kodim. Ibayilu frektimor. What about Shachan v'Kor? What if Samsonovich wants to buy my property in Mississauga, and my brother wants to buy my property in Mississauga? What is the halacha? Tashma toiv Shachan Kor me'avrachik. It's more important to have good relations with your neighbor than a relative who lives far away. Why? Because him live right next door to him. So you should be good with him, so better sell to him. How about Hani Zuzei Tavi, Hani Zuzei Tekule? What if the person who bought it brought me better money than the person who's my neighbor? Rashi says Zuzei Tavi, Zuzei Tekule. Matrin Shabala Ayr Mekach. The neighbor who wants to complain and wants the property, maybe Moish and Mishkal and Toiv, Yoshal Shalakach. He brought money that weighs more. But the money that the actual purchaser paid me was much more legal tender, much easier, much more accepted. Or the other way around. So each money had its own advantage. There is no din the Bar Metzia, because the moicher could say, I like this money better. Or I like that money better. I like the heavier money better. I like the sharper money better. And therefore, there's no din Bar Metzia. There's only a din Bar Metzia if from the moicher's perspective, there's no impact. How about Hanitzari Vanishar? The moicher, the Lakeach gave me money, sent me $100,000 in an open bundle, so I can count it. While the neighbor sent me money, but it was in a sealed bundle, it said 100,000, but I didn't have a chance to count it. So again, less Mishum Din Bar Metzia, because I'd rather have money that's easy to count. as Rashi says, um, Rashi says less the pseudo the moicher loses by taking the money that's tied up. The Amar loses. I need the money now. You don't. If I don't want to open it up, because if I open it up, you might tell me that there was really more money in there. I want to keep it sealed. Therefore, I'd rather not take your money. Okay, so that's something that the moicher also has a right. Zok Gemara weiter. What happens? What happens if Omar Ezel ve'itrich v'aisezus? I sold it to the Lakeach. My neighbor says, you know what? I don't have the cash right now, but let me speak to my bank. I'll get financing. I'll come up with the money. The Allah is loy not treating. The market doesn't have to wait. I have someone with the cash now. I'm allowed to do the deal now. By the time you find the money, maybe you won't come up with the money, and then I'll lose this buyer. How about if he says, I have the money, let me just go to the machine to take it out? Amar Ezel Isis. There it depends. Because if we can assume he actually has the money in his account and he can get it right out, therefore the Ozul Isis he'll bring it right away, as he said. Natrinulay, you'll wait for him. If he love, he loy Natrinulay. How about if I had a property and I rented somebody the use of my property to build a house? So our dechad ubati dechad. So the halach is mori ara ma'akava mori bati. What if the owner of the house decides that he wants to sell his house to somebody else, or take it apart and sell the wood to somebody else? I can say no. I'm the bar metro. You got to sell it to me. But what if I want to sell my property? Do I have to sell it first to the guy who has his house there? Zok the gemara mori bati loy ma'akava mori da'ara. The guy who's just renting space in my house, he's not called a bar metro. He's renting space in my property to put his house there. He's not called a bar mitzvah. Okay, gewaltig. How about our dechad v'dikli dechad? I had a piece of property and I leased you the pairs of my decal for 5 years. So you have a kinyan decal leperoisa for 5 years. So the loch is morid our moti ma'akav morid dikli. If the morid dikli wants to sell his trees to somebody else, I have first rights for it. But moridikli le moti ma'akav morid ara. But the owner of the trees cannot claim the intermetra to the owner of the property. He can sell to whoever he wants. What if two people want to buy the property? Ara labati, one person wants to buy the property because he wants to build a house and live there, and this is an Eretz Yisrael. The Ara lazara, and another guy wants to buy the property because he wants to plant. He wants to plant. So the halacha is Yishuv. We give priority to the person who wants to live there because Rashi says the Bezdin gives it to the Yishuv. It's better to have Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. The less mishum dini the bar metzia. Now I'm not 100% sure that what I'm saying is right. That it's Yishuv Eretz Yisrael because Rashi does not say Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Rashi just says living it is a better use, and for that reason, there's no dina the bar metzia. But I'm going to need your help soon because you're going to see in a moment the difficulty. How about avstik mishonisa? What if anyway you couldn't plow right through because there's a huge stone barrier in between the two properties and you couldn't get your tractor through anyway? So anyway, you have to move your tractor. Or there's a whole bunch of there's a ridge of trees that are very tightly woven together, tight brush, and you can't get through. Chazina, if you can get one row through, you can get one little path to get a tractor through. There'll be a din of metra. Less mishum din of metra. Zok the Gemara, Hani dalad b'nei mitzron. What if there's 4 neighbors? The kadim chad minayu v'zaven. One guy chapped arayim first and he bought. Zvina he gets to keep it. They can't take it away from him. But the kulu also bought the adodi. If all 4 neighbors came together and they said they all want it, they split it as the picture here at the bottom. This guy takes the triangle closest to him, and each fellow on each side takes the triangle closer to him. I want to learn an important toistus. The last toistus on Amud Beis. Our dechad, uvote dechad. Shabayis banui al gabe karka. You have a house built on karka. Mori the ara ma'akiv shalayimkar halo eitzav avan. I could say if you want to sell your house, you want to dismantle it and sell it, you have to sell it kim lo, you have to sell it to me. Avo, the bias, etzel bias. What if the two people owned houses, one house near another house? Oy karka she'eino amid. What if there's no house on it, but it was a piece of property that no one was ever going to plant? It was going to just be a lawn, a tennis court. There's no din de bar mitzvah. The loshayach has some time to come up with. The Gemara said later, we just finished it, that it's all about can you get the tractor through or not. So clearly the whole thing is about it's easier to plant and cultivate and service both fields. So clearly we're only talking about a situation, the only time the din de bar mitzvah is to make it easier for the farmer. That only makes sense. So this whole concept of a Sisa Yosher Vatoy should only apply to a field that you're going to plant. Because it makes it easier to have your two fields together, because you can plow them together. And to sum it all up, the one of the big chuvas at the beginning of his chuvas, he writes, Chazarnu al kol tzidei tzedadim. I checked kol kulo. Rabbeinu Tam says, V'loy matzanu din mitronis bebatim. I never found a din mitronis when it comes to houses. So therefore, if you want to buy a house, even though you know a yid who's a neighbor, you don't have to ask him permission. There's no din mitronis by houses. The problem that I have, and I must be making a mistake, and hopefully someone here can help me, is that we just learned in the Gemara that if I have a choice to sell the property and my neighbor wants to use it to plant and another guy wants to buy a house, wants to build a house, you give it to the guy who wants to build a house. But didn't we just say that there's no din de bar mitzvah? Didn't Rabbeinu Tam say that there's no din de bar mitzvah when it comes to houses? It's only for planting. So why wouldn't I have to give it to the guy who wants to plant it? That's where I'm a little bit confused that I have to find a teretz for. So if anybody can help me understand that, I would appreciate it. So Tosfos over here said there's no din bar mitzvah by houses. Yeah, we just learned right over here.
Yeah, but is the house built already, Yosy? Yosy, is the house built?
I'm sorry?
Is the house already there, or you're buying the property to develop the house?
Ara Labati, Rashi says you're buying a property to build a house on it.
I don't know. My mechutin had a din Torah, and he won the din Torah.
What was the shaila?
The shaila was he lived in one house, and the house next to him became available. And somebody else bought
it. That they have to sell to him.
He took it to the Torah and he won it.
Because the house is be'en. Yosy, I think if there's a difference if the house is be'en or it's just a figment of someone's imagination. So if the house is be'en, then there's no chiyuv necessarily.
We see right over here in the Gemara that if one guy wants to buy it to plant and the other guy wants to buy it to build, right now it's an empty field, you just sell it to the guy who wants to build.
Mr. First's case, the house was already be'en. Why should there have been?
The Tosfos case is bias etzel bias. So maybe with two built houses, maybe there you don't say din de bar mitzvah, and the svar would be it's an individual house, it's a separate house. But if you want to build in the house, maybe there is din de bar mitzvah because maybe you want to build a bigger house. Could be that shot. If there's two houses side by side, if I live here, I don't have the right to buy that house to live in because I already have a house to live in. Not living in two houses. But if it's an empty property that I want to build a house in, maybe that's different because maybe I want to expand and build one big house. I don't know.
No, it was a house next to his house, and he went to a kind of Metzia, and he said he wanted it.
But why did he want that house? He just wanted the house, or he was going to knock it down and build a bigger house?
No, it's for his in-law.
He's going to keep it for his son.
So I don't know. I'm going to have to look into this to see the halacha l'maisa. Because these are all very good questions here. I'll have to do my homework on it. Anyway, I have to sign off because I'm leaving now to New York. I'm driving through the night. Akiva, I want to ask you a favor. If you're able to be up for 7 o'clock, I would ask you to set up the